Brilliant. Okay, so that. Hi, my name's Josh Lait. So I'm speaking here on behalf of our team. I'll introduce the next slide. So I'm from the Science Policy Research Unit, the University of Sussex. I'm also part of the Energy Demand Research Centre. So our project kind of formed originally out of some conversations based on my PhD research, which is taking education policies and imagining them as a form of energy policy and seeing how they impact the energy system. So my PhD research looked at impacts on energy demand and supply, and this project looks at development of or access to green skills career pathways. So this back to introduce the team first. So we've got Irina, Sylvia, who are from UCL and University of Exeter, Helena and Liz Dunn. So it's kind of an interesting team that brings together those working in this kind of exclusion education space, so sociology of education, with Irina, who works in engineering and public policy, and Sylvia, who's looking at this communications representation aspect within climate research. So the purpose of the research is to think about how education policy over the last 20 years, by design, tends to exclude certain people from the possibility of even entering energy career pathways quite early on. And by this, we mean looking at providing alternative provision. So a lot of people with disabilities are put quite early into alternative provision. And the main policy change of the last 20 years was to effectively move these sites off of mainstream sites and put them into these small special schools out of sight, out of mind, where they were not required to teach the full curriculum. And so by very definition there, it kind of creates this kind of disabling ability to access these pathways. Cool. So the project, our objectives, looking at sort of policy barriers. So we're doing an education policy review, and we're thinking about what are the particular policies, both at the national level, but also with a lot of SEND education hours provided by multi-academy trusts who are publicly funded but privately run. They create their own policies, and likewise looking at the local authorities as well. So seeing how do their policies around which pupils are allocated where and on what basis impact who gets to access what. Then the learning experiences, though. So for students and staff and people running these sites, what are the experiences there of STEM learning? Now, the other side of this is around visual representation. So a lot of STEM learning interventions are by definition targeted at mainstream education. When we did our initial scoping review while putting the project together, we noticed that there was very little targeted around alternative provision, and even for mainstream sites, there was often not a huge consideration of disabled pupils within that. And there's two parts of this practical. So you're practically thinking about what is important for disabled pupils, but also this by not being represented is this discursive impact of you're not being seen as part of it, mentally limits what you conceive of as possible if you're not being included within these interventions to try and promote STEM learning. Yeah, so I've talked about this a bit already, but we have doing document analysis, but also interviews, and this would be both with alternative provision providers, but then also with those working to try and promote STEM education and learning, particularly within secondary education. So expected outcomes, so we're going to write a peer-reviewed article which is going to be looking at this relationships between policies of exclusion as mechanisms and and then effectively access to career pathways and what that means for just transitions. There's a lot of focus recently around green skills, and that's becoming quite a big thing within the academic literature, but not around this question of access and disability. Likewise, a policy briefing, which we aimed very much at those working within this space and providing how can we actually start to address these issues of exclusion. And then for the organisations that are working to try and promote STEM, and they might not be coming from EDI background, how can they have better inclusion within their activities? Brilliant. And so just where we're at, so we have recruited an RA, we're currently doing our policy literature review, and we're organising an advisory panel because we think that it's quite important to have co-production and be working with disabled people during this project. Brilliant, thank you.